You are probably discovering as you journey along the spiritual path that a key part of the awakening process is the removal of psychological obstacles which lie within yourself. One such obstacle is grievance, the holding on to something, events, conditions, and so on, which has affected you adversely in the past or which may be affecting you in the present, something which you cannot let go of, something which you cannot forgive. When properly recognized and handled, however, grievance provides you with the opportunity for transformation, for spiritual growth, for awakening to who you truly are, which is what the spiritual journey is all about. The great spiritual luminary Master Jesus said much about forgiveness. Thy sins be forgiven thee, arise, take up thy bed, and go unto thine house. Forgive us our sins, for we also forgive everyone who is indebted to us. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. To cite but a few examples. But when we delve beyond the pulpit version of his teachings, we see that his compassion is not rooted in some abstract morality, but in a deep understanding of reality, psychological, scientific, and spiritual. In his efforts to find a cure for human suffering, and grievance is one of the worst kinds of suffering, the Buddha, another great spiritual luminary in the Council of Light, was perhaps more explicit. Desire, or attachment, lies at the root of suffering, he said, as well as ignorance of the world as it actually is. When you have right understanding of reality, which can be attained through following the Noble Eightfold Path, then you know that the world, at the everyday level of reality, is constantly changing. As such, to become attached to anything or anyone, to impermanent phenomena, including grievances, is actually a pointless task. What happened then is not happening now. What is happening now will not last forever. Everything moves on. It is important to note that Buddha's solution to suffering is not through detachment, but rather through unattachment. Detachment implies rejection or aversion, whereas unattachment can be summed up by the idea of being attached to nothing but connected to everything. Because, as the Buddha also teaches, all things are interconnected. Everything is part of everything else, part of one whole. The perpetrator who caused your grievance is part of you, and you are part of the perpetrator. According to this worldview, forgiveness is not an act of abstract morality at all, but is literally an act of self-forgiveness. When addressing the problem of grievance, it is useful to ask yourself which part of you is holding on to it, which part cannot forgive, cannot let go. According to modern psychology, there are various parts and levels to the human mind, which are described by different psychological models in different ways. According to the model which originated with Sigmund Freud, there is the conscious part and the unconscious part, the unconscious part being defined as a reservoir of feelings, thoughts, urges, impulses, drives, associations and memories that are not accessible to conscious awareness. The unconscious influences behavior on a constant basis, even though people are unaware of these underlying influences. The aim of therapy is to bring into conscious awareness any traumatic memories that may have been stored in the unconscious but are adversely impacting the person's psychological state in the present. This model offers further refinement to the structure of the mind with the concepts of the id, ego and superego, the id being roughly equivalent with the unconscious, the superego being the moral conscience, and the ego the part that mediates between the two. But basically, this model says that this is all there is to the human being, and belief in the supernatural is primitive and childish. The model, which originated with Carl Jung, expands on Freud's notion of the unconscious by adding another, deeper level, the collective unconscious or superconscious. The idea that everyone is connected at a deeper level of psyche is supported by the storehouse of myths, archetypes and symbols to which all human cultures have access. This model does accept that there are dimensions of consciousness higher than the human, and that while human beings are complex, Jung originated the idea of the shadow, they are essentially evolving towards health and wholeness. According to the person-centered model, which falls within the Jungian approach rather than the Freudian, there are basically two parts to the human personality: the authentic self and the conditioned self. The authentic self, the pure potential of you with its innate understanding of what is right for you and its deep sense of social connectedness, the self you were, or indeed still are, before being subjected to the influences of the world. As you are subjected to the influences of the world, you gradually become the conditioned self, the part of you that is moulded by the beliefs, expectations and values, the conditions of worth of those around you, a character in a script written by other people. More often than not, especially for the awakening person, a jarring may emerge between these two parts of you, and this is when you might seek out therapy or spiritual guidance of some kind. Cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT, could be summed up by the line from Shakespeare's Hamlet: "There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so." Here we discover that there are basically two levels to the human mind: the unconscious mind with its habitual autopilot reactive thinking, and the conscious mind which is responsive and takes control. When we have difficulties with feelings or behaviours, we should identify the dysfunctional unconscious thinking and counter it with conscious thinking. As you can see, there is much in modern psychology which readily dovetails with the spiritual view of the human being, which holds that the conditioned self is transient, impermanent, and not, strictly speaking, real, a temporary manifestation of an immortal spiritual being, which lies at the deeper levels of the unconditioned self, and which is, in turn, rooted in the divine source or essence. When we realize that divine essence, which is essentially love, lies not only at our core, but permeates and unifies everything in existence, and that our task on earth is to awaken to and live this reality, we begin to realize that this also applies to everyone else, including those who have triggered our grievances. In this recognition, not only can compassion be generated, because they too are acting according to a script written for them by other people, but blame suddenly loses its target. If you are to blame anyone, you would have to blame the entire family tree of that person and social conditions going back to the beginning of time. In answer to the question then, which part of us holds on to a grievance, finds it difficult to forgive, it is clear that it is the ego, the transient lower self. The higher self, the immortal soul, is characterized by love and therefore by forgiveness, amongst its many other virtues. Since modern science strongly suggests we are co-creators in our own reality, a more useful question to ask might be, why have you manifest this grievance in your life? What does it say about you? Do you need to examine yourself for the traits you see in the perpetrator? What are the thoughts, words and actions that might not be serving you very well? What karma might be at play? Are you having an expansion of consciousness? What new thing might you need to learn in order to grow and develop? All this may take you some time to work out, but do not forget that in any present moment, the present moment being one of the most beautiful gifts of the spiritual path, you can choose what you do with your mind. Certainly when it is a trained and disciplined mind. You could choose, for example, to send the grievance love instead of resentment, and gratitude for the fact that all the painful experiences teach you something and almost certainly contribute to your spiritual awakening. Choosing and maintaining a mindset, however, is, of course, easier said than done. Grievances tend to die hard. So let's take a closer look at what is going on where grievance is concerned. How might you be feeling if, for example, you are excluded from a social event? You might be feeling abandoned, rejected, overlooked, isolated, sad, angry. You might think that you have offended someone, that nobody likes you, that you are unworthy in some way. The list goes on. The ego is very good at torturing us. And if you experienced some form of traumatic exclusion in your early years, perhaps you were the scapegoated child at home or bullied at school, then these thoughts and feelings are likely to be all the more intense. However unkind or unjust social exclusion, or indeed any source of grievance might seem, even to others, the fact remains that your reaction is coming from the level of the ego, from the conditioned, transient, unreal self. We know this because all the so-called negative emotions, the ones that don't feel so good, are rooted in fear. And fear is one of two basic emotions, the other being love. Love is the true nature of the soul, the higher, immortal being, which is rooted in divine essence. When you are aligned with the soul, you are therefore in a state of love and joy, peace and equanimity. When you are disconnected from the soul, separated from divine essence, when you are in the transient, unreal ego, then you are in a state of fear. Once we know this as a fact, then more often than not, a battle ensues between the lower and higher self, the unreal and the real. The ego will insist, but look what they did to me, what they are doing to me. They can't get away with this. Things must be put right. I will say and do this, that and the other to show my displeasure and pain. Or I will punish myself by swallowing the toxic energy and saying a very unconvincing, see if I care. From the perspective of the higher self, things look somewhat different. The challenging situation will be seen as a transformative opportunity. You don't have to like what the other has said or done, but you can still love the other. Contrary to popular belief, love is not really an emotion. It can be expressed through the emotions, but it transcends the emotions, and sometimes cold reason might prove to be more loving than warm affection. In fact, real love is not really directional in the sense conventional reality uses the term, I love you, I love that. No, it is really becoming yourself a field of love, becoming who you truly are, so that anyone, no matter what they say or do, who comes into that field receives your love. You could try and see a grievance triggering situation for what it is. Try and understand, perhaps, why a person acts in such a way. As the Buddha says, to understand all is to forgive all. You could remind yourself that all things are interconnected and part of one unified whole, and that in judging others, you are actually judging yourself. Furthermore, considering that everyone has an immortal soul at their core, however deeply unrecognized by the ego, then how much more loving it would be to not lose sight of the inner being of other people, particularly perpetrators, and to see all the mistakes of the person as errors which create karma and require correction, not sins which require punishment. If you persist in your grievance, then be sure you are in your ego and are also cut off from your divine source. You will feel pain. It is an inevitable part of life, but pain and suffering are different. Suffering is when you hold on to the pain by replaying it over and over in your mind. Why not try sending it love and gratitude for what you are learning, for how much better you feel knowing that it is possible to end suffering? Because it just doesn't feel good when you hold a grievance. Or you might get temporary satisfaction from hurling a cutting remark or even getting revenge, but experience must surely tell you that this will be short-lived and will most likely have its own consequences. More karma, that is. Ending a grievance ends the cycle of karma for both you and the perpetrator. Again, this is easier said than done. For a truly enlightened person, there might be no need for forgiveness at all, but for those who are awakening, it might be a struggle. There might be a healing process to go through which will take some time. What about the person who has been severely scarred in an unprovoked assault, or the woman who has been violently raped? Can you just say to them, "Forgive your attacker, it's the Christian thing to do"? The person is likely to tell you where to go, and quite rightly, from the psychological level that is. Eventually, they will have to forgive if they truly want to liberate themselves from the trauma, to move on. But as the person is wounded, traumatized, this needs processing and healing. It might take time. The person might need to offload, make sense of things, find a place in their psychological landscape to position the event safely. They might need psychotherapy, energy therapy, or a trauma therapy like EMDR. Whatever the trauma, whatever the grievance, however, dealing with the fallout is your responsibility, simply because no one can do this work for you. Whatever happened was for you to learn and grow. It might be helpful, however, when doing the work to remember a few things. That by continuing to hold on to a grievance and therefore continuing to suffer, you are continuing to give your power to the perpetrator. That the ego needs to feed its pain body, as Eckhart Tolle describes it, on a regular basis, and so doesn't really want to let go of its suffering. Someone's got to pay, it will tell you. I'm like this because of you. It might be useful to remember that forgiveness, or the realization that the perpetrator is an immortal being having a temporary, conditioned human experience too, sets you free as well as them. It is very difficult, if not impossible, to truly forgive from the level of the ego. The ego might try to forgive, but will almost certainly keep coming back to the "yes but," as it repeatedly succumbs to the fear-rooted attack-defense mode of someone disconnected from their source. As Einstein famously said, you can never solve a problem on the level it was created. You can't deal with an ego problem from the level of the ego. You have to deal with it from the level of the soul, the higher consciousness, the immortal spiritual being that you truly are, wherein lie all the other higher attributes and virtues, including forgiveness. At the level of the soul, there is no hurt, no suffering. The soul, because it is anchored in reality and sees things as they really are, is able to see the inner spiritual being beyond the pain of disconnection in the perpetrator, is able to see that karma is being played out and that this process is what fosters our learning and evolution. You might of course be in a situation in conventional reality where things need to be said or done. At the global level there might be issues you need to proactively protest. Apartheid, genocide, environmental pollution and so on. At the personal level, you might need to set boundaries or even remove yourself from an abusive relationship. But while you are doing all this, try not to lose sight of the other's inner being, and maybe they will catch sight of it too. Both Jesus and Buddha retreated into solitary meditation for lengthy periods of time so as to master the lower self and access ultimate reality. What they described, although in very different terms, is not inconsistent with the discoveries of modern science. Everything in the phenomenal world is in a state of constant change. Everything is interconnected. Everything is made of energy. Energy is imbued with information. Matter and consciousness are connected at the deeper levels. From the scientific perspective, a human being, as are all manifest phenomena, is a temporary assemblage of atoms consisting of particles which are essentially units of energy. We are, that is, intelligent energy that has coagulated in a form for a period of time to presumably serve some purpose. From the spiritual perspective, this collection of atoms, intelligent energy, is a vehicle for higher consciousness, higher energy, so that more and more consciousness at ever higher levels can manifest the glory of the divine through the evolving physical form. Furthermore, it is becoming increasingly clear to the spiritual aspirant, and this again is backed up by conventional science, that the universe seems to operate like a giant mirror or boomerang. What you bounce out to it, it bounces back to you. Hence we have the sayings, reap as you sow, what goes round comes round, and the Chinese adage, if your enemy hurts you, seek not revenge, sit quietly by the riverside and wait for their head to roll by. These are not vengeful statements, but observations of how reality works. They basically describe the workings of karma, whereby whatever happens to you in life, you are somehow, at some level, attracting or manifesting. Knowing this provides you with a golden opportunity, because now you will begin to take conscious control of your own mind, to take conscious responsibility for your own thoughts, words and deeds, for your own vibrational frequency, and therefore for your own destiny. The practice of meditation provides an important way of connecting with the soul, with higher consciousness. Meditation helps you to gradually gain mastery of your own lower nature and to live your life consciously and mindfully. When you become responsive rather than reactive to challenging situations, you are more likely to use the space created, the present expansive moment, for transformation. This in turn will render you less harmful, harmlessness being our aim on the spiritual path, not because some abstract moral code says so, but because it is ultimately the best way to experience less suffering, because in an interconnected mirror-like universe, when you harm someone else, you really are harming yourself. Grievance, above all habits of the lower self, can be incredibly intractable and warrants the evocation of your inner spiritual warrior to deal with it. The battle that takes place between the higher and the lower selves is beautifully summed up in the old Cherokee tale about a conversation between a grandfather and his grandson. The grandfather tells the grandson that there are two wolves fighting a battle inside every person. One is filled with love, joy and peace, and the other with hate, misery and trouble. When the grandson asks which one will win, the grandfather replies, the one that you feed. When you hold a grievance against someone, you are fixing the other person and yourself to a specific point in time. You are not seeing the changes in both you and the perpetrator that might have occurred since then, if the grievance lies in the past, or the potential for future change if the grievance is occurring in the present. You do not see that time moves on because you are living in the pain body, in the ego, which lives in psychological time, in time that is, that does not really exist in the here and now. It is cut off from the divine source, which can only be accessed in the present moment, the eternal now. Consider how much lighter you may feel, how much higher your vibrational frequency, how much more vibrant your energy, when you no longer carry the fear sack around on your back. Why not release the sandbags and let your hot air balloon rise? The world today is clearly in trouble at a global level, and as we watch the corrupt machinations of the ruling elite, who, with their fear-mongering and warmongering, do not seem to have the best interests of the people at heart, it might be very tempting to become critical and judgmental. From the perspective of higher consciousness, they are also immortal spiritual beings having a temporary human experience with all its challenges, and there is nothing to forgive. Only errors that are a way of learning and evolving, the main error being that of separation from source, and consequently living in a fearful, false ego state. We should be wary of falling into the same trap of grievance and unforgiveness as our perpetrators. If we would like to see conditions of love and light, peace and healing, happiness being established on the earth, then that is what we must send out to them. You might find that conditions improve for all of us if you can transform hurt or outrage into something deeper in yourself, into compassion, tolerance and understanding. Don't forget, the higher spiritual beings who are guiding your spiritual journey have in turn to put up with your errors and frequent lapses into unconsciousness. A grievance, with its repetitive thinking and excessive rumination, clutters up your mind and takes up vital energy which could be used for something else more positive, something healthy and creative. Forgiveness sets you free and allows an expansion of consciousness which allows in more of divine essence. So, as the poet Rumi says in The Guest House, Welcome everything that occurs in your life, good or bad, as a gift, because it has come to teach you something. We sometimes think the challenges of life are too much to deal with, and sometimes they are. But imagine how boring a game without challenges would be. Not much would be accomplished, and not much growth would be done.